to this conversation. We are here with Michelle Huang, who's a brilliant scholar who's very raised in the digital, and we and Huan, who's going to be introduced shortly, are going to be respondents. And we also very much rely upon and hope that people in the audience will be able to be part of the conversation as well. So guidelines, we've been over a couple of them. If you have an issue, if you're online and something isn't working, you can chat Sarah Torsch, who is sitting in the back. If you have a question you'd like to ask, you don't need to wait for the Q&A period. I think you could just put it in. So feel free, we'll keep track of that queue. Also, please don't record or live tweet this session because this is obviously work in progress, but also this is more of a talking thing. So it would be great if you. So here's a map of what DISCO looks like. It is 6 lab managers or co-PIs, me, Ray Couchet at Purdue, Stephanie Dinkins at SUNY Stony Brook, Remy Virgo here at Michigan, Andre Brock at Georgia Tech, and Catherine Steele at the University of Maryland. We came together as collaborators and as people who mutually inspire each other to try to create research on a new anti-racist, anti-ableist digital future. So each of these co-PIs has built their own labs, but we're kind of a lab of labs and a network of labs. And one of our goals is to create a pipeline of scholars and scholarship for people who are coming from non-normative backgrounds, racialized or disabled. So we're here today partly due to the generosity of English, communication media, American culture, Asia Pacific Islander studies, and the STS program. And we have a couple of events which are open to the public. One of these is a disability pedagogy workshop. This is that is going to be happening on October 27th. That's run by the Digital Accessible Futures Lab, Teaching Well Crip, a disability pedagogy workshop. And the second one is through that's through Catherine's lab, BCAT, Black Communication Technology Lab, writing the book manuscript. This one will have a book editor in the room, as well as the wonderful mentorship of Catherine Steele, who book won awards recently. You might have heard of it, November 9th, 1 to 2. So if you are interested in this content or related content or any of the workshops, please fill out a request to be a member. All that means is that you are invited to stuff and you get newsletters and you learn about opportunities to collaborate and participate in things that you're doing. If you're interested in being more deeply involved and you want to possibly write something with us or write something about this, you can apply as an individual or an institution to be an affiliate, which means that there'll be kind of closer collaboration, but probably more expectations about participation. So our agenda is as follows. Michelle's going to talk for 35 minutes, and then Juan and I will respond briefly, and then we'll have some This is me. I write books on race, gender, and the internet. Have for a really long time. I teach a course called The Internet is a Trash Fire for freshmen who enjoy that course. I used to have to explain to them what that meant, but I think completely everybody. Juan has a PhD in American Studies at the University of Southern California, and he is a postdoctoral fellow appointed through the DISCO Fellowship as a member of the network, and we are super excited about his research on Asian American literature and culture. His book project is tentatively entitled The Racial Interface, explores the racial associations like Asian Americans and information technology in the digital era. Huan has been published in college literature, media, and an anthology on Asian American game studies. He's going to start a position as an assistant professor of English in Asian American and Asian diaspora literature at Vanderbilt University. So we'll only have a year. And he's going to be teaching a course in the winter. Do we know what
it's called? Race and the Technological Imagination.
Obviously, everyone needs to take it.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And I'm just going to briefly introduce Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Michelle Huang, Assistant Professor of English and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Huang's research and writing spans a wide range of topics, including Asian American literature, posthumanism, feminist science studies. She's currently working on a book project titled Molecular Race, which examines posthumanist aesthetics in post-1965 Asian American literature to trace racial representation and epistemology at non-human minute scales. As a huge personal fan of her work, which has been published in American Literature, Journal of Asian American Studies, Contemporary Literature, Post 45, Contemporaries, and elsewhere, I find Dr. Huang to be an incisive theorist of racial form and at the forefront of thinking about how race matters and continues to matter in the distorted representational regimes of capitalism and post-humanism. Dr. Huang is also the co-creator and on-screen star of a film essay called Inhuman Figures, viewable through the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. It's really a stellar multimedia work that I think is a model for accessible, public-facing, and teachable scholarship, and really, I think, is a must-have for any class on race tech and science fiction. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Huang.
I'm like very blushing now. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, Huang, Disco, for the invitation, to Eric and Jessica for your tireless organization of the entire trip, and all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to share my work and to be So in June of 2021, the New York Times published a feature called The Cost of Being an Interchangeable Agent, profiling mid-level white-collar professionals who experience the all too common microaggression of being confused for another Asian American in the workplace. The article details the origins of this phenomena from the turn of the century yellow peril imagery portraying Chinese railroad workers as a mass horde of similar bodies, the dehumanization American soldiers learned to apply to Asian faces during US wars in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And the presumption here is that Asians and Asian Americans are human too, right? That specifically we should be recognized as individuals. That's kind of a recurrent theme in the article. However, in my work on contemporary Asian American literature and culture, I'm interested in deconstructing the white universalist category of possessive individualism and seeing what political possibilities and critiques emerge from engaging with non-human collectivity. So today I want to try to think through with you, how can thinking about clones help us think about Asian American racialization? So rather than simply pointing out the many racist underpinnings of the all Asians look the same trope, I propose that genomic fiction extends a curious provocation to Asian American literary studies, that we are not biological enough. As scholars of science and literature have pointed out, the discourse following the completion of the first draft of the Human Genome Project in 2001 tends to fall into either genetic determinism or dismissivism, and those are both oversimplified. And by be more biological, that doesn't mean reject insights regarding the social construction of race, but to extend its critique to the molecular scale, because otherwise maintaining a sense of biology as immutable substratum actually reifies the category of human. Didn't go next. I pointed out. What did I do? Oh, it's there. Technology. So, Mel Chen, invoking Simone de Beauvoir, summarizes this premise succinctly. If there are ways in which biology is made, not born, then we should be cautious about naively romanticizing the generative enactment of healing. As such, posthumanism answers genomic fiction's provocation by revealing that the assumed self-evidence of the biological human is not a transnational, transhistorical category, but one written and rewritten time and time again, and that governs the fatuous, recurring trope of biological race. Genes are not race, but the way we think about race is increasingly genetic. So to examine what I mean, I turned to two novels about cloning by Asian diasporic authors, Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, 2005, and Larissa Saltfish Girl from 2002. Though frequently categorized as dystopia, Never Let Me Go was written in 2005 and is set in the late 1990s. So it's actually retroactive in that way. Some folks here may have read it or seen the movie, but the general plot summary is that there's a first-person narrator, Kath H. She reflects on her time at Hailsham, a boarding school in England, and her life thereafter. It becomes evident as the novel progresses, though, that Kath and all the other students at Hailsham are clones, whose primary purpose is to provide organs for ailing people. Spoiler. Before the students become donors, they work as carers, supporting the donors, and that's where Kath is in her progression, both at the novel's beginning and end. It's all recollection. The novel makes no mention of its main characters' races, but Ishiguro's pointed avoidance of last names for initials purposefully creates ambiguity about race. That, in addition to his pointed choice of a first-person girl narrator, shows it is the mode of reproducing race that matters, not skin color. The novel endows a they with the capacity to speak, typically reserved for I, to pressure the scientific production of race as a category of difference. In other words, ironically, by not being immediately and identifiably about race, I argue the novel lets us see the processes of racialization more clearly, how it is made, not born. And here I want to present explicitly the definitions of race and racism I'm using. So race per Junaid Rana, who's at UIUC, is an epistemological category of white supremacy that maintains structures of violence and dispossession. While racism, from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability through premature death. So you can see that both these definitions are meant to de-essentialize and denaturalize race as something that is contained within an individual's body, right? For us to view it as a structural schematic instead. Never Let Me Go is also blanketed in a marked lack of consciousness about scientific development, in particular the cloning technology, which enables the lives of Kath and her peers. And so it's not a hard science fiction novel in that way. Ishiguro is very literary as such. So I think we can think about parallels between racial epistemology and scientific epistemology here. So one of the common refrains I hear when teaching introductory level Asian American studies classes is, I feel so dumb for not knowing anything about this. And my response is actually always, you're not dumb. It's that Asian American history, literature, culture have been purposefully withheld from you, right? The feminist philosopher Nancy Huan talks about epistemology as ignorance in her work on the women's health movement. So thinking about how ignorance is epistemologically constructed. So this is really frustrating in a work of science fiction, though. There's no info dumping or, as you know, Bob, on Planet X, this is how things happen. Like, we don't get that at all. We never learn the scale or scope of the cloning program, the models of clones there are, who the central administration is, and so on. If people will remember back to Brave New World, it literally opens with a tour, right, of the factory lab. So this novel instead situates readers with the students as the have-nots of information, those who cannot understand their own identity because of the withholding of history, i.e. the conditions of their own production. The whole history of the cloning program that gave rise to Hailsham is not explained at all until the very end of the novel in a few sentences from one of the administrators that recount how the students are made in test tubes after the war in the early 50s, when the great breakthroughs in science followed one after the other so rapidly, there wasn't time to take stock to ask the sensible questions. Suddenly, there were all these new possibilities laid before us, all these ways to cure many previously incurable conditions. So not only does it suggest this kind of linkage, right, between technology and war, but also to analogize this to our world, the students, like Asian Americans imported by the United States after the Civil War and after the Civil Rights Movement, are presented as a solution to a problem. And in our world, in the 20th century, the shortage of exploited labor caused by Black liberation. This purposeful miseducation regarding material and scientific history, I think, is formally and ideologically instructive. Never Let Me Go is most often read in terms of genetic engineering, but I want us to read it in terms of reproductive politics. If Miss Emily provides the positively inflected explanation for the clone's existence, the health-giving effects on sick loved ones, then the darker side and the darker history of reproductive control is pointedly missing. Race has always been a central locus of reproductive management. As Dorothy Roberts writes in Killing the Black Body, the social and legal meaning of the genetic tie helped to maintain a racial caste system that preserved white supremacy through a rule of racial purity. The genetic tie to a slave mother not only made the child a slave and subject to white domination, it was also supposed to pass down a whole set of inferior traits. However, while the law of hypodescent made the children born by women's slaves, generating the economy of slavery, by contrast, the clones in Never Let Me Go are made sterile. And here we can think about early prohibitions against the immigration of Asian women, producing bachelor community populations, as well as the persistent association of Asian Americans with childlike or naive students, as opposed to adult leaders. The compulsory sterilization is important in the context of controlled racial reproduction, and that control is what becomes challenged by the unruly fruiting bodies I'll discuss in Selfish Girl. Further, from a position of unmothering, cloning is inextricable from a larger program of racial reproductive justice. Elise Weinbaum notes that in all situations in which human biological life is commodified, processes of commodification must be understood as subtended by the long history of slave breeding practiced in the Americas and the Caribbean. So just as the clone's history is hidden from them, the longer history of reproductive management is hidden from contemporary discussion of cloning and biotechnology. So Kat's imagining of herself as a mother, which is where the title of the book comes from, refracts this unmothering central to racialization, contesting the loss of reproductive control. So Saidiya Hartman's influential theory of racial fungibility refers to the economic objectification of Black people, the conversion of bodies into exchangeable value on an account sheet, right? This is literally, in a very literal way. She writes, the fungibility of the commodity makes the captive body an abstract and empty vessel vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values. And as property, the dispossessed body of the enslaved is the surrogate for the master's body, since it guarantees his disembodied universality and acts as the sign of his power and dominion. In Never Let Me Go, the value of racial fungibility is visible in the exchange of clonic death and the extension of non-clonic lives. Parts of the clones become valuable and human. They are literally assimilated into the bodies of those deemed human, while the rest of their bodies are left more and more debilitated until they die. Race is the technology that allows for the conversion of body into currency. If you think back to Gilmore's definition of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And more importantly, rather than collectively protest this injustice, within the novel, the clones fantasize about being exceptions to their predestined roles, about transcending their clone status and avoiding becoming donors by proving their human worth. And these fantasies of conditional inclusion are what keep them docile, peaceable, and rule following. So my point here is not to say that the clones in Never Let Me Go are literally racialized women, but to emphasize how racialized and gender technologies produce clones. It is in the clone's function as fungible, sterile containers of value that I locate Asianness. Nathan Snaza says that Never Let Me Go's clones are, quote, not an analogy or figure for other types of dehumanization based on race, gender, et cetera, end quote. But here's the thing, it always is. Not only does the lack of biological relatives in both the legally enforced singledom of early Asian male immigrants, Kat looks for her possible, or the person that she's cloned from, in the pages of porn magazines, turning the pages quickly to look for familial connection rather than climax. Thinking of clones as racially fungible bodies that are necessary to maintain the livelihood of humans thus allows us to see how Asian American identity itself will always be rendered clonic and inhuman because the origins of its production are hidden. The clones' identities lie not in what they are, but in how they were made, and they'll always be made wanting. So I will spend the rest of my talk talking about Chinese Canadian author Larissa 2002 novel Saltfish Girl, which is a very different book. So If Never Let Me Go's clones are pointedly colorblind, biologically identical to their originals minus the ability to reproduce, Saltfish Girl's clones are explicitly other. They're Asian, female, transgenic, meaning human-animal hybrids. And as an aside, I really cannot overstate how weird this novel is. Everyone should totally read it. It initially reads as two distinct stories. One follows Nuwa, a mythical snake woman hybrid who creates the human race from mud, while the other traces the story of Miranda Ching, a young woman perpetually reeking of durian fruit, who lives in the neoliberal economic dystopia of serendipity, kind of Disneyland-esque, possibly present-day Vancouver, in 2044 to 2062. However, it eventually becomes clear that the two threads of this narrative are one, albeit in a very knotted, intertwined form. So it's very formally experimental that way. For those of you unfamiliar with durian, it's a very threatening looking, super potent fruit. Smells likened to rotting meat, smelly gym clothes, sewage. In the book, they call Miranda Pissy Pussy, for example. It's actually outlawed on the subway in Singapore. Serendipity, where Miranda's family lives before their expulsion into the unregulated zone, is the name of the walled city run by a Monsanto-like Saturna corporation, a company whose main industry is genetically modified organisms. Saturna engineers fruits, vegetables, animals, and as the novel eventually reveals, human-like transgenic clones. The two series of Asian American female clones they produce, Sonia's and Miyako's, are spliced with carp and cat genes, respectively. In Serendipity, citizens legible as humans live privileged lives defined by the gratuitous consumption of products created by those classified as non-human, not so different from the world. Like in Never Let Me Go, we see that traditional categories of race based on skin color and blood percentages have now been modified by biotechnological innovations. This new racial order allows Saturna, which controls the means of clone reproduction, to also control the means of clone production. Within the novel, the manufacturing of expensive Nike-like sneakers requires continuous labor input in the form of over 100,000 Sonias who labor to produce them. And the scale of this labor is much bigger than I even imagined in 2002, right? So for reference, the Foxconn factory alone has over 350,000 workers in it now in Shenzhen. One of the urban legends that circulates amongst the Sonias is that their genetic material is derived from a Chinese Canadian woman and her Japanese Canadian husband, who were both interned during World War II. Again, highlighting the deep symbiosis between scientific development and war making. After being modified with a sliver of carp genes to get around laws banning human cloning, each clone worker is named Sonia and then given a number, i.e. the character Evie, who's this kind of renegade lesbian militant, has the assigned name Sonia 113. Evie is not only marked by her animality through her fish genes, but by a serial number also as a machine. And at the base of her spine was a series of numbers, which looked at a distance like they'd been tattooed on. But if you looked more closely, the digits were raised ridges filled with some kind of powdered black metal. They could be read by touch, frail beneath the skin. The numbers evoke prisoners, Japanese American internment, the Holocaust, and commodity objects, all manifesting racial fungibility as well as the portability of this branding technology. Her cyborgian Asian body is literally stereotyped, right? If you think about the origins of that word that's mechanically reproduced. This mirrors how racist dividing technology works outside in, not inside out. Asian Americans are made robotic, made clonic. Half proud, half sarcastic, Evie reveals to Miranda her genealogy is 0.03% Cyprinus carpio freshwater carp. I'm a patented new fucking life form. So according to the laws that govern serendipity and a particulate reductionist model of inheritance, this snippet of genetic code nullifies Evie's legal personhood and consequently sanctions her and all the other Sonias as exploitative employment in the shoe factory. The percentage of carp genetic material is laughably small, signifying an arbitrarily determined mathematical point that slices between human and non-human animal by unity. The sliver of carp DNA becomes synecdoche for Evie's whole, evidencing how genetic magical thinking allows microontologies to structure and govern larger scales. Almost humans like Evie are juridically legible as nothing more than GMOs, and consequently, like the many modified fruits and vegetables that populate Saltfish Girls' world, do not receive human rights or consideration. Yet all the explicit markers of Evie's subhuman position, the barcode, the tracking device, are installed on her body by Dr. Flowers and funded by the shoe production facility. And this shows the key limitation of a human rights-based discourse is not human rights in and of themselves, but the ambiguity of who is defined as human. Liminal cases like the Sonias can be killed, but not murdered. In the book, as in our own world, there is a legal system, but no justice. Indeed, intellectual property law, as signified by Evie's ironic self-identification as patented, aids and abets the clone's marginalization. And I think we can think a lot about trade partnerships and special economic zones here. However, Lai also shows that Evie's disadvantaged status as a clone is what enables her to develop a more quick-thinking, street-savvy intelligence than Miranda did growing up enclosed in Serendipity's walls as well. As the two series of clone women, Sonias and Miyakos, are spliced with carp and cat genes, respectively, they signify a trademark monoculture, and again, reproductive control. In Life as Surplus, Biotechnology and Capitalism in the Neoliberal Era, Melinda Cooper critiques this trademarking of organisms. Where does reproduction end and technical invention begin when life is out to work at the microbiological or cellular level? What is at stake in the extension of property law to cover everything from the molecular elements of life, biological patents, to the biospheric accident, catastrophe bonds? What is the relationship between new theories of biological growth, complexity, and evolution, and recent neoliberal theories of accumulation? As Cooper points out, the conception of property has shifted from the organism proper to information. Patents, not deeds, are the mode of enslavement in the novel, changing the scale of production. While deeds are tied to an individual body, the turn to ownership via intellectual property and patents allows for endless replication across economies of scale. Accordingly, the definition of the human in Lai's serendipity is one determined by discrete bits of information rather than function. Racialized and gendered workers like the Sonias and Miyakos are functionally human, able to perform the work of humans, but legally not. During the workers' rebellion, the Sonias embed subversive messages into the soles of sneakers so that when worn outside, messages are trod into the ground. One sole reads, materials, 10 units, labor, 3 units, retail price, 169 units, profit, 156 units. Do you care? So rather than humanizing themselves, the Sonia's message objectifies themselves as economic inputs. As clones, they are acutely aware of their own devaluation as a population whose demise and limited lives are required to promote the internet's limitless lives of others. Accordingly, the post-racial, rather than ushering in an era where race has become irrelevant, might be better thought of as denoting the importation of racial logic into smaller and smaller scales of the human body, to the point where it becomes illegible as race, and it thus shows a need to follow racial production all the way down to the molecular scale. Vulgar biological definitions of human reveal the antinomies of the category itself and expose the limits of legal juridical discourses of justice that still rely on an individual rights framework. Such an extension of humanist logic will always fail to contemplate non-normative bodies that fall without the boundaries of the human. In other words, inviting others, racial, gendered, sexualized, disabled, animal, into the fold of humanity will always be a doomed enterprise because the human is not an essential stable category, but rather an adaptive logic that emerges through processes of dehumanization. And in the longer version of this chapter of my book, I discuss in more detail how the human isn't even human. So not only are we descended from fish, the only way complex multicellular organisms like ourselves could have evolved in the first place is through the incorporation of many different bodies, not cultural Darwinist notions of survival of the fittest. We would just be very large single cellular organisms. Race continues to be a primary and powerful articulation of the humanizing difference, and the proliferation of biotechnology means we must follow its iterations. Michael Omi, in a presentation reflecting on the 30th anniversary of the publication of racial formation in the United States at the 2016 Association for Asian American Studies meeting, warned that given the rebiologization of race and the creation of new racial categories, Asian American scholars in the social sciences and humanities must revitalize and update our understanding of STEM fields and the life sciences in particular. While there are powerful reasons to refer to collective experience and identity, presenting any broad definition of race as stable or readily identifiable homogenizes the existence of those who can be captured under that category. The more ossified the category, the more it achieves the semblance of ontological self-evidence. In a moment of pedantry, Dr. Flowers, the scientist responsible for engineering the clones, warns Evie, who refers to him as her father, Barry Frankenstein, about the dangerous hyperfertility of the wild GMO durians, such as the one that led to Miranda's birth. So as a backstory, the durians were originally created to assist with fertility treatment, but then were so hyperfertile, their seeds blew everywhere and started to grow unregulated beyond the boundaries of the walled city, and became able to impregnate women on their own. So I really cannot stress how wild this book is. So the point is, right, that they've escaped the strictures of the lab, the factory, and eventually the city themselves back to nature. So as a minor spoiler, this is how Miranda is born and why she stinks of durian. So Dr. Flowers says of the wild rains, you don't know what monstrosities might have come of those births. Those trees have been interbreeding and mutating for at least 3 generations since the original work. The fertility those durians provided was neither natural nor controllable. It was too dangerous. Evie, but what you did to make us was not. I should cut your heart out and eat it. I'm a scientist, Evie, whereas those Sonias, not human. Neither natural nor controllable, Flowers says, suggesting that either is acceptable, but neither is not. His formulation explicitly elevates himself, the scientist, over those Sonias, not human, in a distinction that intimates the former is entitled to control the latter, the right that stems from his perceived ownership over their beginnings in the lab. In actuality, Flowers is intimately involved with his own creations. He's married to a Miyako clone and is revealed to be working on male clones in his own image. And as he is eventually outwitted by and killed by his own creations, far from being an all-knowing or powerful scientist, he represents the eventual failure of scientific control and mastery over racialized and feminized reproduction. Despite probably intellectually knowing how inconsequential 0.03% of DNA is, we share 94% of our DNA with chrysanthemums, for example. Dr. Flowers' words exhibit anthropocentrism, belief in a human exceptionalism that divides human from non-human. He relies on the same Enlightenment great chain of being logic that underwrites race, where species and races are arranged in hierarchical order that places white people, negroids, closest to God, Black people, negroids, closest to primates, and Asian people, mongoloids, in the middle. In the chain, fish are positioned well below mammals and birds due to their watery environment, as well as their putative diminished consciousness. The genogenic splicing of fish and human thus signifies the literal reincorporation of difference that authenticates the species' genetic thinking under race. It's very tautological, right? The supposed concreteness of genetic science is substituted for the socio-political processes of dehumanization, colliding the latter to present the appearance of self-evident ontological difference. So here it's important to remember that the concept of race arose at the conjunction of 2 historical moments, the scientific revolution, so privileging the study of nature, particularly its classifications, as well as the age of colonialism, establishing hegemonic economic relations with unfamiliar and political and social entities. So today we see how modern human genetic discourse often uses technology, professional expertise, and the authority of the scientific voice in support of goals that are not classically or normatively scientific. So although Evie as a clone refers to herself as an early model, wryly acknowledging her techno-scientific origins, She refers to the other Sonias as her sisters, denoting a kinship that reasserts familial relation. Deviating from a nuclear family template, Selfish Girl presents an Asian American intergenerational narrative structured through reproductive technologies and labor conditions, rather than kind of domestic nuclear family stories. Through its fishy relations, the novel also establishes interspecies kinship, echoing Donna Haraway's claiming of Onko Mouse, the first patented animal, as her sibling, and more properly, male or female, they are my sister. The temporality the clones Sonias enact is one of a distributed and overlapping understanding of self, rather than limited to this kind of all look the same uncanniness typically attributed to similar bodies. So questions of cloning, xenogenesis deform the smooth trajectory of an individual human life, together marking biological personhood not as fixed or singular, but as multiform and distributed across time spans and spatial ecologies. And as such, they are part of the longue durée of Asian American racial formation tethered to the constant rearticulation of the human. And more broadly speaking, literature and other imaginative media presents a way to trace the constant generic evolution of the category of human, which has always been subtended by the story of the non-human and of racial formation. Although Miranda is initially disgusted by Evie and the other Sonias, she eventually finds herself attracted to their clonic sameness. She muses, "I did not feel half so creeped out as I did envious. To have access to oneself as an old woman. Was it like that for them? Did Sonia 14, having lived up, share Evie's foibles? Had she come to an understanding of them? Did she see Evie's life as an extension of her own, as a second shot at those things that had failed the first time?" For the repetition of the same phrase creeped out that she had used earlier in the novel to distance herself from the clones evidences Miranda's shift in perspective. Indeed, she comes to embrace and even sexually connect with the clone she previously found creepy. So in response to the opening problem of Asian interchangeability, I argue these clonic narratives suggest that claiming intrinsic individual humanity will always be a losing proposition, one that reduces racism to individual bias and embedded in the reproduction of labor economies and scientific discourse. Instead, I propose we be neither natural nor controllable. Thank you.
Want to start? Or should I start? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Huang, for that excellent talk. Michelle, try to, keep it professional. It was a great talk, and thanks for taking us through those two really rich Asian diasporic texts. Especially, I have always been a huge fan of Larissa Selfish Girl. It is absolutely a weird text, and it actually inspired me to try Journey, which I was not a huge fan of. But anyway, I have kind of three main comments, and I'm going to try to keep it to 5-minute allotted response time, and some questions tucked in for you to pick up or maybe leave as well. But every time I encounter your work, I feel like I'm retrained anew to think about how race articulates itself, especially in its, sometimes taking on its most powerful form when it doesn't articulate itself, or when it's distorted and mutated through scientific and biological processes and scales. A line that really stuck out to me, felt particularly powerful: genes are not race, but the way we think about race is increasingly genetic. I think that was a really powerful way to put it. Listening to your talk, what I find so productive about your work in your talk, but just your work in general, is how you take these common kind of layperson understandings of race and racism and kind of show how they actually register something deeper about the scientific life of race. So what was really instructive, starting with the framing, the common microaggression in the New York Times article of the interchangeable Asian, I think that's something most people in this room would recognize as a racist stereotype, or I hope most people would. But in the context of your talk, I'm struck by how these stereotypes themselves have so much critical potency for thinking about race in new registers, and that the case of the interchangeable Asian is actually a coded everyday encounter and assessment of the genetic scale of racial meaning making at work that's usually never fully carried out to its analytical capacity because they're simply dismissed as a stereotype, right? Asians look alike, it's a bad thing. But that type of moral kind of dismissal is also a critical dismissal as well. And what's so persuasive about your work is that you ask us to stay with these stereotypes and really to dig deep because they're registers of the inner workings of racial logics and forms. And the speculative text that you explore all demonstrate this really. So there's also kind of a pedagogical component, which I kind of have, would love to hear you talk a little bit more about as well, in terms, in the sense that many students or other kind of readers who might not be educated in race studies understand the vocabulary of a stereotype. And I'm wondering if you find critical value in studying and staying with the stereotype and how they might help students and readers enter into a conversation about racial logics. I'm also struck by your use of Hartman's theory of racial fungibility, in which bodies become abstracted vessels for value, desires. I love the line where you say race is the technology that allows for the conversion of body into currency. It stuck out to me, especially because I've been thinking about the recent inclusion of anime Huang as the first Asian American face of US currency. I go days were kind of floating in the background here as well. But when I'm thinking about Hartman's theory of fungibility, I'm also thinking about her theorization as a critical challenge to the liberal term empathy, which is about centering the self-possessed feeling subject, while also using racialized bodies as surrogates for meditating on ideas of humanity and ethics, rights. And empathy is an interesting term because it has both meaning in terms of literary and humanist registers relating to a character's feelings, but it also obviously has resonance of like technological registers as well. Design thinking, empathizing, VR machines as empathy machines, thinking about Lisa's work. So I guess I'm wondering if the occasion of racially unmarked characters allows us to complicate novels and narratives as, empathy machines, in the sense that a lot of students and readers have this impulse to really wanting to relate to characters and wanting to relate to stories as kind of a knee-jerk reaction into a text. And then just really quickly to kind of end, I love the final provocation that you end on. Instead, I propose we be neither natural nor controllable, especially in the context of like the Sonias in Saltfish Girl and I love how you brought up kind of Foxconn and maybe you could think of the Sonias as a literary figuration of Foxconn workers. But I wanted to invite you to maybe talk about the we here in terms of, who is the we? Whether Asian racial form can actually be an entryway into a type of comparative racial analysis, or if you see possibilities there, especially thinking about the Asian factory worker, might be, for example, the kind of racial electronics laborer par excellence, but by no means is the factory worker exclusively Asian, right? So, who is this we that you end on and have us think about? And I'll end there, but thank you so much.
Should I respond? Or do you
Yeah,
go
do
first?
please do.
Oh, thank you for making me sound smarter than I feel. That was awesome. Please read everything I write. But yeah, so many thoughts. So your first kind of nexus of thinking, right, about the way that there's these scientific underpinnings, these broader genealogies underneath kind of common cultural conceptions, I think is super important. And it does kind of come through pedagogy. I think it's like, it has to do with staying with the stereotype, because just saying like that someone is not a model minority or something doesn't actually do anything to dispel the fact that it feels so true, and that Northwestern is like a third Asian American or something like that, right? Like the only way it's not that the model minority is in fact a myth or something that exists, but that it's cultural. There you have to understand its cultural and historical context, which has to do with immigration laws, wars in Asia, the comparative ascension, like letting Asian Americans succeed while putting Black people down, like all those things together in the middle of the century. But I think even more than that, the thing that always occurs to me in thinking at stereotypes is like the politics of inclusion, So it's this idea that in the New York Times article, it's like, if only we could be seen as individuals and included. And it's like, well, in fact, like the whole point is that we're not included. Like we cannot be seen, and what's so great about being included anyway, right? The presumption in this case, I think, is really included in whiteness too. And like when we talk about Asian American racialization, racial formation, we talk about assimilation, it's always into whiteness. It's not like into Black Americans or something. So I think that staying with these stereotypes, thinking about who the dehumanization serves is really important, and there's value in being included, and who governs that wanting, right? If you think back to Never Let Me Go, the clones, they don't learn about how they're made. They sit there reading Thomas Hardy and George Eliot. So it's like they literally are instructed to try to be like British subjects, right? It's very literal, like Bacodian, like, schools, a Saidiya biopolitics kind of thing. Then your second kind of question about racial fungibility, and I mean, I could like talk all day on like why empathy is stupid, not as like a feeling, I guess, but I think as a, in the way that diversity, equity, inclusion now have become completely meaningless words co-opted by neoliberal multiculturalism. Like, I think the same thing about empathy, and how you illustrated the way we teach it is so problematic, right? Because it's about possession. It's like trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And it's like, I don't want empathy, I want responsibility, right? Like one should not always be trying to imagine what it's like to be someone else, because you actually, one, can't, and two, that's really problematic. So like when I teach like When the Emperor Was Divine, a Japanese American internment book, for example, it like the last chapter actually pointedly interpolates the reader view as a white person, basically. And I think it's really important to have students, readers, people, instead of trying to possess the experience, to then take responsibility for the context of the experience. And I think that's true when we teach ethnic studies in general, right? Like as a second generation Taiwanese American, like Japanese American internment's not my experience either. Neither is Vietnamese, like, refugee fiction. Like my parents worked at like Bell Labs and Pfizer. So I think it's really important to think about positionality and the sort of context in which we are even able to read these texts, which I think kind of brings me to your last question about the we. And it's true, the we here is really just Asian American people like listening to my talk at this moment. Because like it actually takes time you need leisure time to like read and imagine, right? So I think then the question is like, what is our responsibility as people who have the privilege of being together in this room to people like the Sonias? And there are many, avatars or counterparts in our reality currently, like the Foxconn workers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think reading it, specifically in the context of disco, we've been thinking a lot about, or at least me, in terms of planning my class, like how these literary methods might actually be entryways and like, these kind of hooks of thinking about how we enter text might be entryways into engaging STEM students with some of these topics. So thank you for kind of, elaborating on these kind of meterly or students.
I didn't get to address the comparative racial analysis thing. I think that's really important too, actually, because like, I think, white supremacy benefits from provincializing us, right? So from like separating out like Asian Americans, like instead of all being called like Thai racist studies or something like that, right? It's like, oh, it's about these sort of ethnic formations. right? So then we don't think about the way that, Asian Americans are racially triangulated with Black Americans. We don't think about the consonances in thinking transnationally between the maquiladoras at the southern border and the special economic zones in China or the Caribbean. So I think, I feel like doing Asian American studies now, particularly, in an era that's like correctly thinking about BLM, really requires like thinking about these sort of comparative and coalitional possibilities of what Asian American identity is beyond sort of like representation without difference, which is like maybe something like Crazy Rich Asians or To All the Boys had learned before.
So this was an amazing talk, and as well, I wrote down races and technology as a conversion of the body into currency, because that just really made it very clear. And it's such a great way to teach too, because then it invites people to think of examples where that didn't happen, which are hard to think of. But I had some post-COVID questions, because I feel like doing work on race and biology after COVID is somewhat different. So I wanted to ask you about the power of imperceptible differences. So the 0.03 snippet and why it matters that it's so small, right? It has to be visually illegible and readable only by machine. And talk about how that might relate to some of our genetic magical thinking today, that our imperceptible differences somehow more powerful even than perceptible differences. And what does that say about, as you're saying, the scale issue, right? That, I think that the idea of the imperceptible really informs a lot of what we're considering genomic thinking, but how is that warranted by politics or like by behavior? And I also wanted to ask you about clone literature as a pathos-driven form. Now, when I read this novel, when I read the movie, I just all out cried. It is really sad, right? Like you would have to have a heart of stone not to be moved. But the whole point of the book is that you show you're human by your ability to suffer. So they make them make art so that they can see that they can create something unique. But really the reason the book works is that you can see the suffering, and therefore these are people that deserve your empathy and that they are people as well. So if there's resistance to this tragic genre that leverages the empathy or what have you, right? The kind of affective resource of pathos, what's the opposite of that? Is it something like Saltfish Girl, which I admit I have not read, but does not sound like it's about crying a lot. So is there some other resource, emotional resource that can be brought to bear other than the kind of tragic, I guess in pre-20th century literature, like tragic mulatto, tragic clone, tragic android, like that genre is really strongly racialized, I think. And so my post-COVID question has to do with two things: health insurance and augmented reality. So all of a sudden, after COVID, everybody knew everybody's name because Zoom has annotation. So you knew things about people that weren't available to you. Like maybe they had a last name that was spelled a different way than you thought, or it all of a sudden provided new information. So as you're talking about the way that being an abject laborer, that is to say a slave, means bearing a mark upon your body, which is readable as a number or as data, right? So the barcode, which is a trope of cyberpunk where people are the barcodes and stuff. And dogs have had chips for a long time, right? Is there some way that augmented reality after COVID, and I'm counting Zoom-ish, right? But Apple's going to put out its headset pretty soon. I hear it's going to be like $3,000, something like that. And it's going to be an AR headset. It's not going to be an AR headset. It's going to be completely about engaging with the world and getting more data about everything: locations, people, objects. Probably it's going to be a lot about buying stuff real fast because Apple's good at that. But it's going to involve a huge amount of personally identifiable information from the user, like retina scanning, stuff like that. So is there some way that we should be concerned about this in a way that these novels help us understand is already racialized before we even know what Apple's going to do? And the other one is about health insurance. So as you say, it makes no sense that the individual rights framework determines our capacity to live or die based on where. So if you have a certain kind of job, you have certain kinds of health insurance. And even if you have certain kinds of jobs within certain institutions, you have different kinds of health insurance. So students have different health insurance here. And that's just a given. It's kind of already coded into the system. So is there some way that a collective rights framework might make really everyday interventions into the ways we understand what rights are, access to health, and what would that look like? Is there some other way that kinship could be understood that could be brought to bear that would create solidarities around very simple things like access to healthcare, which is kind of the original lab science justification, is that eventually this will help humans one day, no matter what it does to animals or the environment or to whatever. If eventually it will help humans one day, then it can be justified.
Amazing. Thank you. Wow. Okay. So trying to think about all the stuff post-COVID too is just so interesting. Okay. So the first question about the imperceptibility of difference, because it is comical, right? 0.03% is like 0.0003 or something like that. And I think it's obviously then meant to make fun of the sort of percentage where you think about blood in general, whether it has to do with hypo descent and thinking about the history of slavery in the country, or what quantum that we use to authenticate whether or not Indigenous people are allowed to be a part of their own nations. So kind of this kind of arbitrariness of math, right? Like Natalie Diaz has this great poem called American Arithmetic, which is like very much about that, I think. It also, I think, speaks to, as you said, Lisa, the scale issue, right? Like, I think that lies asking us to think about, like, we feel race as very truthful. Like, I do feel like an Asian American woman. Nevertheless, I know intellectually that it's not the case, that it's structural, historical, contextual, all these things. So I'm always interested in trying to think about at what points does it become visible or invisible, as you're saying, perceptible or imperceptible? Is it at the scale of voice? Is it reading the way someone has written something, the way people, hearing music, right? These are all ways that people think they can tell race.
Yeah.
And then you can challenge it over and over again. So I think, though, there's obviously lots of low tech ways of challenging it as well. And some, like the music examples, are like food made by a real Asian person or something like that, but also passing, right? And I think passing is a technology that happens in both novels as well, and as a way of sort of inverting the idea that there is something scalable all the way down to a very small scale that is, you could point at and say it. I think it also contests, like, just sort of our own scientific illiteracy, like the variance in DNA of people from Africa is more is wider than the difference between people from, like, Scandinavian Africa. And I think that's very hard for us to comprehend, sort of because of how speciesist our sort of notion of race is, even though we know, I think, like, that we are all the same species, and that it's actually just sort of climactic difference over time. But nevertheless, that's very hard to process. Yeah. That second question about sentimentality, I think, was so important. And I mean, it kind of goes back to Juan's question of we too. It's like, obviously, so the novel can only interpolate someone who's already reading a Kazuo Ishiguro novel to begin with, which is not most people, and certainly not, for a variety of reasons, a lot of people who would be the clones or clone workers in either. It's like, again, it's a leisure activity, a solitary activity. And the way that humanness is pegged to both, as you said, pathos, like the ability to suffer, and art, I think, is really important, right? It's like the thing that distinguishes humans from animals is the ability to make poetry and paint and stuff like that. And I think then it becomes a meditative commentary on the book, right? The way that we demand a certain type of human, we demand that subjects prove a kind of human value in order to be recognized as valuable. But again, it's very tautological. Like, we say that this kind of self-consciousness, this kind of art making is what makes one valuable individual, worthy. And I don't think it's a surprise in the story that it's like all pegged to love, right? It's like the oldest thing ever. It's like heteronormative love. It's like if you can prove, the clones can prove they're in love, then they can escape, like, you know, being disemboweled or something like that. So I think there's like a marriage plot combination probably in that as well. I don't know, like, so you said, should we be concerned about
I guess the
augmented
answer is always
reality?
yes.
And I was like, yeah,
always
but I don't know if I have deeper thoughts about it, especially because I'm so passive about my own data. Because I think I get very fatalist about it and it goes the other way. And I'm like, none of this is about me. It's about the aggregate me. Like none of it's real or something. But yeah, I think that, I don't know, the sort of, I guess it requires a deeper understanding of, it requires an understanding of ourselves, not as individuals, but as disaggregated data, maybe. So then thinking about how that might apply to our sort of exposure and the way that it's extracted from us is like, it's not, I guess that's the point. It's not personal, and that's bad.
Right, yeah.
Too, right? It's even more totalizing. Like I guess like I'm thinking about how people are like, oh, like my phone listens to me and then gives me these ads or something like that. It's not that the phone is listening to me, Michelle, and gives me an ad based on that, but it's like the sort of like data body. And I do wonder about what happens as things become more and more homogenous, like as a result of these kind of data bodies, these data bodies, what sort of possibilities for indie or non-corporate like imagination, you know, like I just like notice how me and all my friends have like the exact same sheets, bags, shoes, like, you know, things that just kind of proliferate.
Oh my gosh.
And then, yeah, health insurance, I don't know, I guess like what I wrote down, yes, I often think about like, can I adopt my friends to get them health insurance? You know, you can't adopt someone old with a thing that I learned, but you know, beyond single payer healthcare, you know, I guess this is not a solution, but two of the things I was just thinking about as you were talking were just the problem of elder care in the country. I feel like COVID made visible and it's just going to get worse. And I feel like this is the sort of vengeance of the emphasis on the nuclear family and like people living in individual houses has now both resulted in an extreme housing shortage and no one to take care of old, sick people. So I feel like these are going to be the twin sort of issues of elder care and housing are going to collide in really horrifying ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think the power of the way you read these novels is that you can totally see this is now. Like this is not a fantasy and it's not in the past or the future. It's literally describing.
Yeah. And they were like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
We should open it up for questions. I'd like to ask a question. Yes, Sarah?
There's one in the chat. I don't know if you guys have access to the Q&A button in there, but I just wanted to make sure you know that they're coming through that way.
Yes, you do.
I actually can't see.
I had to turn mine up because it was keeping up the sound. But did you want to?
Maybe we can do some of the in-person ones.
Yeah, let's prioritize the actual people. So-
And then
The actual people.
Yeah, it's not- everybody's question is addressed.
Yeah, Ida?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much for this really great talk. I think I found myself, partly I recently taught Blade Runner. And so I think I was just thinking about a lot of ways that that film has been interpreted and the way it could be interpreted. But I think I feel like you already started to answer this in your response to Huan, but this kind of question about where does this kind of like contemporary discourse of representation fit in? Because there, for example, some people have written about the way that the replicants in Blade Runner can speak to race in a way that maybe is more powerful than if they did read as racialized on screen. In fact, they're like very, very kind of Aryan looking. And of course, that movie has its own techno-orientalist politics. But there's also something like Pleasantville, which I've written about, where there's kind of commentary on the relationship between color, but it's an entirely white cast. And so I know that 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 conversation is sort of maybe more when it comes to film and television than literature, but I'm wondering, like, especially maybe with your students, how you kind of address these issues, because I think we can probably agree that representation is not just the solution to these issues, but it also is a real thing, like the white option in Hollywood, and the whole sort of controversy around Scarlett Johansson being cast in Ghost in the Shell. So it's because I totally support leaning into this kind of deconstructing and defamiliarizing race through its apparent absence. But yeah, how does it kind of intersect with kind of contemporary discussion? It's not, I mean, not contemporary, but discussion around sort of representation and visibility.
Thank you. That's such a great question. I think I'm just thinking of Blade Runner and like the way that the eye test is like, the recurringness of the Turing test, which we can think about both in the biological sense as it is in the movie, but then when Lisa's talking about the art making too, right? The way we're always asking people to authenticate themselves as human. But yeah, I mean, I definitely hate Scarlett Johansson more than I hate All the Boys I Loved Before. Like, I think they're like, I think that, right, I'm interested in one, like how race persists in things that are either putatively non-human. So obviously clones are sort of human shaped non-human things, but I'm also interested in how things like environmental racism or the way we talk about plastic, for example, is like one of my chapters is very racialized, like the things that are not. Yes, that's actually one of the ways I started thinking about my work was at an environmental studies conference where they just had all these like words associated with plastic, and it was like made in China, toxic, like, cheap crap. And I was like, Asians, like, so thinking about the way that racialization sticks to things that are not human bodies is sort of my interest there. Of course, the end result is actually to help us be better humans, right? Like it still is real. So, but to your question, that I think it's like, what do we think of as an Asian American story? It's just like replacing, the main character with an Asian American actress, like changing the stories of like like to keep bagging on to All the Boys, which I actually kind of enjoy very much. Like it's like, oh, the choices between like multiple white boys, like that's not, like what kind of story is that? So I'm also interested to go back to the comparative race thing about what keeps like Asian American girls, for example, from not seeing something like Beasts of the Southern Wild as like a story they can identify with. Like, what would it mean for Asian American girls to see themselves in like Black girl stories or something like that, as instead of just sort of being excluded from whiteness and then having this sort of superficial inclusion. So I think when we start to unpack that, what constitutes like a politically Asian American story or something like that, then it's like, oh, we have to touch the histories of war, like America war making in Asia, of queerness, like all these other things that are not just sort of the assimilative logic of heteronormative whiteness. Yeah. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for this. My brain's like, oh, this is so cool. And thank you guys for your great questions and discourse, and especially this discussion on empathy was really great. And I think in your talk, you talked a lot about like race turning humans/bodies into currencies and into like sort of fungible tokens. But I also wanted to ask about like, what do we make of like a lot of like younger people's desire to be like non-human, to be like object, to be like a token in that sense. And I think like, because I have a lot of peers who like talk about daily how we want to become cyborgs, become a machine. I think like that sort of desire, ironically, is also supported by like mass production and like fashion and like mass production and like exploitation of like workers in like the global south. So like, how do we make of like that desire to be like non-human, to be like clonable like tokens, when like that desire is so ingrained in like that racialized economy? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, totally. I think, so yeah, I think this idea of what the function of this identification or disidentification with the human is, I think is like kind of what I heard in the core of that, right? So if like I'm thinking about like Franny Choi's like poetry or something like that, and she kind of situates herself. She's obviously she's a human person who voices like robots, right? Like she uses the eye of lyric poetry to voice a robot. So it's like, what is happening in that situation though? Like she uses it to highlight the sort of objectification that happens when you live in a body that's an Asian American woman or something like that, right? The kind of sexual objectification there. So I feel like it's about like the function of it. So in the example you're kind of giving where people are using the non-human maybe as like a costume, it sounds more like, right? That it's actually not challenging the possessive logic. It's actually just inhabiting it. And I think that this would be actually something more like yellow face or appropriation, right? Like where then it's like me dressing in like a tiger costume is not like me becoming tiger. It's just like exoticism. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here and speaking to us today. But so the question that I had was related to sort of like the organizational and corporate powers that are sort of addressed in both books and how they've impacted the labor market. And within this, obviously exploitation is occurring. And this kind of relates to the idea of being commodity, which was kind of addressed in that definition of racial fungibility. So I wanted to ask, we talk a lot about the model minority myth and how, as a group, we kind of subscribe to this idea that our value comes from our interchangeability, which is kind of what was related in the New York Times article. But I wanted to ask how to address these concepts and kind of communicate these to people who are outside the scope of academia as we increase our dependency on technology, as it evolves to augmented reality, virtual reality, and how that kind of relates also to the privacy aspect that you were talking about. That was a lot.
Yeah, thanks. So I think so the sort of organization / powers like part of it, like I feel like that is sort of the point of Never Let Me Go, right? That we often get kind of trapped at this like level of like how extractive logics manifest in our day-to-day life, which of course is really important, but then like maybe don't even have the ability to see or understand what produced them in the first place, because they're so busy making their art and like trying to fall in love that they're like, who the F like made us in the first place? Like, where'd we come from? And I think that that's kind of what I was trying to say about like students being not understanding like why they don't understand things, and that thinking about how that ignorance is literally produced and like it's a feature, not a bug of like Asian American amnesia, I would argue, right? It's like why we don't want it to be part of the curriculum in like grade school and stuff like that. Because what would happen if people started thinking about it when they were like 5, like versus when they're like 18? Then to the how to communicate this stuff to people who are not academics is, I think, a live and ongoing issue that I would love to hear from other people about. I mean, making the video film essay that was mentioned was like a huge challenge for me as someone who's a literature scholar who doesn't work in a visual medium most of the time. So to think about how the visual, I mean, Enlightenment epistemology is so visualized. So I think like it's really important to then try to work against that, but you need to use it. I mean, so many of the examples of things I'm talking about are from bad examples, right? It's like Ex Machina or Blade Runner, things that like we're supposed to be critical of from our position. But in terms of like how to teach, I think often like, in my opinion, students respond a lot to like counterintuitive history things that then explain to them why they feel the way they do. So with the model minority, if there feels like there's a truthiness to it, and then when you say like, oh, there's the 1965 Immigration Act, let's think about how it created a selection bias for STEM tech workers, right? Like how it both privileged people who had education in these fields who are coming for advanced degrees, as well as family reunification. So what do you end up with when you have an immigration law that selects for STEM workers and families, a population of people in this country who are STEM working, like, families. And we see that both those things are now stereotypes of Asian Americans, right? That they are good at STEM and family oriented. And it's like, but who did that? Like, it was literally produced. Like, Chinese Americans in the United States are, 12 times more likely to have a college degree than people in China. Like, so is educational interest like a Chinese quality, or is it brain drain? Like, so I think things like, back to the like leaning into the stereotype thing instead of being like, look at the heterogeneity of Asian Americans, which I think is actually really important also, but to like take seriously, like, why does it feel so true? And then there is always a reason, because as we know, it's not intrinsically racial like characteristics. Thank you.
I have a question from the online audience. I'll just read it word by word. This is from Chad Shimura. Thanks for the rich, compelling talk, Michelle. Like Juan, I am struck by your invitation to be neither controllable nor natural. I would love to hear more about the connections between race and nature. When you push away from the natural, it seems like that's because nature is predominantly imagined to be static, mechanical, and ahistorical. Is that image of nature what underpins cloning as racial form and the increasing reduction of race to genes? Could there be minor images of nature that are dynamic, incomplete, and creative? So maybe getting at some, not thinking about bad examples, but good examples. If so, might drawing on these minor natures alter racial form to be convivial to your call for uncontrollability?
Wow, thanks, Chad. I think Raymond Williams in Keywords, right, like has nature as like the most complicated like entry or something like that. What is nature? But I think to focus on this question, yes, I think that when we use nature as a discourse, it represents a fantasy of organicness, of purity, right, of sort of modifiedness or something like that. But I would argue, right, like that the durians in Saltfish Girl, these GMO things that then like proliferate on their own are nature, right? Or like, as the kids would say, nature healing itself or something like that. So I'm interested in like kind of what we might think of as like gross nature or dirty nature, meaning like not pristine, not denying human like intervention and things like that. Like, I think when we talk about like, nature and we think about the environment, people think about returning it to like pre-human, like terrain or something like that. But I think we can think about it more as like post-purity politics. Like, what does it mean to create a place despite, its contamination, despite toxicity that we can't undo, right? Like, we already destroyed the environment. Like, how do we then live in sustainability or ecological relation to one another? I think Nathan has a question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming all the way here for this talk. This is really, really fun. And I love the term clonic. I think it sounds good. It took me a while. But I'm really struck by Dr. Nakamura's invocation of the kind of art litmus test or Turing test that takes place. The two parts of it that really stuck out to me were Hailsham as this. Hailsham kind of exists as this project, right? It's meant to prove that people possess some humanity, and it's funded by this wealthy benefactor. And so, like, I'm really interested in the like figure of the benevolent institution, as I think you can see the kind of parallel balances in something like the DEI office, right? That like, or like, and the kind of neoliberal cooptation and that. Yeah, I wanted to hear what you thought of that kind of the figure of that benevolent institution and its kind of articulations in present racial discourse. But like, art as a litmus test stood out to me. A friend of mine runs an AI art account on Twitter, Sam King, and there's like really intense discourse right now about AI art, and people have such strong feelings. And what struck me is that like a lot of the rhetoric around in the anti-AI art, AI generated art camp, a lot of that vitriol is like really voiced in like rhetoric of like the soul from like people who like normally would not invoke such rhetoric whatsoever. But it's like, no, like this art lacks a soul, there's no spirit behind it. And it's like, what are you talking about? What?
Asians.
Yes,
yeah.
no, there's like such a, like, especially in light of this talk, there's like such a racialized component to that. So like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like, in addition to AR and VR, which I think is super salient in light of the metaverse, AI is the like third pillar of like sci-fi dystopias, right? It is arguably the antagonist in everything from the Matrix to Blade Runner. Where does like AI figure into like clonic conceptions of Asianness?
Okay. Yes, should we be skeptical of schools as institutions? Yes. Do they appear in the guise of benevolent, fostering philanthropic beings or something, entities? Yes. So I'm thinking of like, at Northwestern, there was like the 20 by 2020 thing where it was like people, the administration was very proud that they had gotten a 20% Pell Grant eligible students by 2020. Nevertheless, when students demand things like books, more class consciousness, more different representation in professors and stuff like that, that's not okay, right? Like, so, I think that speaks then to, again, these conditions of inclusion, which are often really centered around like preserving a certain type of respectability politics, and then wanting people to perform a role as tokens, basically, right? Like, and to feel grateful for being at all. To the question of AI art, I feel like AI is people still. Like, I don't know, like it's all people. Like, so it's like if the algorithms are like taken from our own, like algorithms are just like, to me, condensations are already extant notions about like culture, right? So it's like if the input is already like, biased or selected in a certain way, what's going to be produced is just different permutations of that. Like it can't really do anything beyond that. Do we as humans do anything different than that? I also don't think so. So I don't know. Like, I just feel like it's AI is humans and humans is AI. I'd like to know what Lisa thinks about that.
Algorithms are social formation.
Right.
So,
They're just condensed, yeah.
but I think the idea of the algorithm is really the antagonist or a character in all of these older novels too. AI is a long history. I'm reading about Charles Babbage and how much he hated noisy people. And women and people of color, and he made the databases to kind of say how annoying they were, and that was like the beginnings of the difference engine. Like, that history is so long. This is Seb Franklin, Digitally Disposed, which I feel like got kind of this book. His book is about race, but it doesn't have that many actual artifacts that attest to that. That one really did, where motivation for doing algorithmic work is separation.
Yes. Like, I mean, you think about Francis Galton, like literally the father of statistics, it's because he was a eugenicist. It's like, it makes sense. Why would anyone want to create a whole field of study where you assemble populations and then find out the norm? It's like literally so you can get rid of the undesirables. Yeah. Yes.
So I have a question related to quantification, but specifically the molecular and political. So I think in your talk, the trace, the ways that production of particular kinds of Asian Americans is tied to the economies. We have the Civil War, so civil rights movement, those two instances produce certain kinds of inclusion for Asian Americans. And so you also suggest that race today is molecular, or to study race, you have to go down to the molecular level. And you pull up the quote by Melinda Cooper where she suggests an affinity between the molecular and neoliberalism. And so I think one way we can think about neoliberalism is through atomization and just in general, like discretization and why the digital plays such a big role today in liberalism. So I don't know, I don't really have like a concrete question, but I'm just really interested in hearing more about how you make the connection between molecularization, atomization, and race more generally today. So in one of the books, you kind of talk about how it's like individual organs. So it's not so much like the body as human, but actually like discrete parts of the human can be counted as human and others discarded as non-human. And that seems very connected to, I guess, like political economy today, but just in general, I'm really curious to hear about some comments.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. So I think one thing is, this is like in my own brain, I like make a distinction between the atomic and the molecular. And to me, the atomic is what you're speaking of, the sort of logic of neoliberalism, meaning like the individual, right? Like the kind of self-contained homogeneous object or something. And that's the thing that we think of as like kind of building blocks for the world, but specifically of race, right? That there's something discrete inside a person that is identifiable as race that can be pointed to. Whereas when we think about the molecular, one of the, you know, taking this from Deleuze and Guattari, and they're thinking about the molar and the molecular there is meant to emphasize the heterogeneity and synthetic nature. So to me, thinking about race as something rather than atomic, but that is molecular, that is synthetic, contextual, and heterogeneous, sort of that distinction, even though, yes, they're both like at the minute scale, clearly is like being emphasized there. And that's just like, you know, I think that there is a lot of really good work skeptical of the sort of valorization of post-human or non-human to, like Jordi Rosenberg has a piece like critiquing the sort of primitivism of the molecular, but I think that they're talking about the atomic, like in that way. It's like specifically about the idea that the world can be broken down into discrete objects. Yeah, thank you.